Welcome to the ZNL Podcast, a podcast brought to you by ZN, the OG digital agency in Brussels.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the ZNL Podcast. I am very, very happy to have with us today Brandon Mitchener, who is an experienced communicator, former journalist, corporate advisor, and much, much more. And you've actually worked across a number of different fields. And so it's always very interesting to have your perspective on things. How are you today?
Well, very good, Phil. Thanks for the invitation. Always happy to join.
Well, you've had a really interesting and varied career working in the corporate sector, in journalism, and advising clients on campaigning. And so I want to ask you the question, which is really about your perspective, where you have that journalistic background, but you also know what the corporate side is trying to do, which is communicating in a very complicated environment. So in 2025, how do you feel the kind of information or misinformation landscape is looking? You know, how bad have things got for journalism? And, we can talk a little bit about so-called legacy journalism and new media. So how do you feel about this landscape?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people feel that it's getting worse,
Right.
and I don't disagree with that. I don't really have the data to hand to know whether that's something that we can document, certainly. But when you've got governments, some people would accuse the US government of spreading misinformation. Certainly we have Putin spreading misinformation, the Chinese spreading disinformation. So when you have state actors spreading misinformation, that's something which is very difficult for a company or a business association, or let alone the individual or some group of volunteers to counter.
Now, you started your career as you were early in your career a journalist. Looking at what, sorry,
still am occasionally.
Occasionally a journalist. So, when you were a journalist with that hat on, what were you focused on, and how has it changed for what today's journalism is about?
Yeah, well, I would say the facts. I mean, this may sound kind of simplistic in the context of the fight against misinformation, but I did have the privilege of working for U.S. business media for 15 years. And the beautiful thing about U.S. business media, it is for the most part apolitical. I mean, we were not under any direction to color our reporting in a certain way or to choose our stories in a certain way. I did work for the New York Times for 3 years, then the Wall Street Journal for more or less 9 years. The Wall Street Journal may have changed a little bit since it was bought by Rupert Murdoch, but I think he has actually not gone as heavy-handed on it as many people feared. I know people who still work there, and they say actually he's been a godsend to the Wall Street Journal by investing resources in a major news organization that otherwise had issues. So I think that there is still hope in mainstream journalism, and particularly business journalism is where I still get a lot of my news because I trust it. Whereas most of what passes for mainstream journalism, let's say, generalist newspapers and magazines, television, let's not even go there, or we do. I don't trust what they report nearly as much as I do if it comes from Reuters, Bloomberg, or Dow Jones.
Right, but there is a big kind of perception or narrative that, again, I'm going to use the word legacy media, which is already colored, which is that that media is no longer driving conversations in society. In recent elections, whether it's in the US or in Romania or in Europe, we've seen whether it's TikTok or podcasts, Joe Rogan's podcast, really having, I would say, more impact than legacy media. So my question to you is, do you think that traditional media is kind of gradually becoming less and less relevant and being replaced by those new media? Or do you think there's still actually quite a lot of importance for these tools? And what would you tell those journalists from those old traditional media, what do they need to do to be relevant again?
Yeah, well, I would say both things are true. I mean, I think that the legacy media still has a role to play, and a very important role to play, because if for better or worse, they do have resources. They have very very thorough fact-checking operations, multiple levels of editors at something like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, Reuters, etc. They've all got quality control built in. Whereas some of these others, if it's just a guy with a microphone in his bedroom, quality control may not be the highest priority. That said, I don't think that the advent of all these new media is a bad thing. We saw in the last couple of US elections, for example, also European elections, that the mainstream media were sometimes horribly out of touch. They just had no idea what was happening in the country. Whereas a lot of these podcasters do have their finger on the pulse of the nation, and they know what's going on. So I think competition is a good thing. Media pluralism is a good thing, and the more people who are out there talking to real citizens about real problems, the better that is for democracy ultimately.
Yeah, but there is a narrative that's being kind of hammered very strongly by certain political groups, saying that that this media, the traditional media, be it CNN, New York Times, BBC, whatever, is kind of biased. Perhaps not all the time, but I mean, this is obviously when people when they disagree with the news, they say, "Oh, you're being biased, you're fake news," or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think anything changed in the media, or it's just because, I mean, we didn't really hear that, I would say, 10 years ago. Is it a new narrative that's just, the media hasn't changed, but the narrative has, and so it's much easier to discredit them by just disagreeing? Or do you think there's actually a problem? There has been some quality problems with the, let's say, neutrality of some of these channels?
I think there have always been some questions about the neutrality and the objectivity of some media, even the financial media that I talked about. And I'll just tell you a small story. So when I, left the Wall Street Journal in 2004, I agonized over this. I had been a journalist for 15 years. I loved journalism, and I asked my father, am I doing the right thing? And he says, "What are you worried about? Everybody hates journalists." And this was 20 years ago. And I said, "Really?" Most of my friends were journalists. For me, journalism was a force for good in this world, and I still think it is and can be. But I think maybe those of us who are news hounds like you and me, we rely on the media. We read six or 10 different things a day, and we feel the value of it. Whereas most people, that's too much information, and they don't trust any of it. If they've only got one thing to listen to, they're going to listen to the one that most entertains them. That's the sad reality of media today.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, what you just said, because it's true that there's always been skepticism for journalism, and there has been low quality journalism. I mean, there's been tabloid, in the UK, you have Daily Mail, and you have things that you could always say they were just making stuff up.
Yeah.
And so you always, and also political journalism, which, basically the British press that was very anti-European, for example, was constantly coming up with that narrative. So if you're looking at it from an external perspective, you'd say they're not being objective. They have an agenda. But I feel that has become much easier for people to say, which is to try to dismiss a journalist because of that story, which is a kind of very easy narrative, which is maybe building on that skepticism of journalism.
But I think a lot of that has always been unfair. So when my father said this to me, 20 years ago, everybody hates journalists, I didn't think it was true then, and I don't think it's true now. I think that people, may have a healthy dose of skepticism, which is not a bad thing. They probably need even more skepticism. But I think that the media still play a fundamental role, and especially the mainstream media, because let's face it, what governments pay the most attention to are television and the mainstream media. It's changing slowly over time as you get podcasts and people who become celebrities on their own. Some of them have been catapulted into the White House and administration in the US, for example. But I think that the mainstream media will continue to play a role in many countries.
Yeah, I think I use the media to just check stories and assume that they've been better researched than some thought piece that you read on social media. However, it's true that you have to say this still has a perspective, it has an agenda, and you have to kind of filter through that. So your basic takeaway is to say, yes, there are issues, but it still plays an important role. Do you think it's going to kind of continue to erode in the future with the podcasters and the Joe Rogans of this world becoming the most powerful forces, forgetting about objectively whether what they say is true or not? But do you think that they are going to become the news anchors of the, what we had in the 70s and 80s will be the podcasts of the future? What do you think is happening there?
I wouldn't say it's impossible. I listen to some of these political podcasts myself. I enjoy them myself, but I would never use that as my only source of news. I think if they complement the news that people are getting from other more traditional, more mainstream sources, then that's a good thing, because again, media pluralism is a good thing. The question is whether the average citizen, man on the street, has the bandwidth to consult multiple media a day or even multiple media a week. I mean, and then do they fall into the trap of trying to expose themselves to a false diversity? I tell you, a member of my family who should remain nameless told me once that she liked Fox News because it gave both sides of the story. And I honestly did not know what to make of that, unless it's right and further right. I mean, they're certainly not in any way objective or balanced. But there is a perception that, somehow they provide a balanced perspective, maybe balanced vis-a-vis CNN or balanced vis-a-vis other more left-wing sources in the States.
Yeah, I am finding it more interesting and more important to try to get these opposing views on social media as well as in traditional news. There's a website called Groundswell, I think, which has like a measurement of different perspectives of a news story, whether it's left, right, center, and it gives a kind of like a measurement on where you are. But yeah, I think it's very important for citizens to try to do that. But I think when I see the way traditional journalism is produced and talked about, there is something very kind of formal and very almost robotic. A little bit like you have corporate speak. With journalism, a news story is like, oh, I'm serious, I'm looking at the camera and I'm giving you that news. And I'm just wondering, with AI coming online, to me, the question is, if the news anchor is not opinionated and is just delivering you facts, why do you need this to be a person? If the person, if you have an articulate AI avatar giving you that, and if you think, okay, I want my news to be this, this, and that, I'm just wondering, do you think, because it's happening in some places, AI creating the news, we've even got avatars, but it doesn't have to be an avatar, it can just be the written news. So how much do you think AI is coming into the news space, creating news reports and analysis for people?
I don't know the answer to the question, to be honest, but I'd say I don't necessarily fear it. It all depends on, whose AI and what's the motivation. If it's a Russian AI, and maybe you don't want to give it a lot of attention. But for example, if one thing that I like about even the first generation ChatGPT and others is they would present, let's say, multiple aspects of something, and then it would never be as simplistic and black and white as something as a simple Google News search, where the top couple of posts might be sponsored posts. There might be misinformation just because they've got the most traction and the most backlinks from a well-connected community of activists on a certain topic, for example. Whereas the ChatGPT version will give you a more nuanced version, and it'll say, take it all with a grain of salt. The views differ. If you're asking a health-related question, please check with your doctor. If it's a financial question, please check with a certified financial planner before investing your money. So I think that's actually really, really helpful and good for democracy in the end.
Yeah. So before, we've had a whole series of elections in the past 12 months, and a lot of people were saying, AI is going to amplify deep fakes, misinformation, and everything will go crazy. I don't think that happened. I'm wondering what is your perspective on the role of AI in amplifying and spreading misinformation, and where you feel this is going. Because there's still the narrative that AI is going to create these massive misinformation campaigns. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, to be honest, I think AI makes it easier for people to create misinformation and deep fakes. If it's a fake photo of a president or somebody from the commission doing something silly, I think that has the potential to work a lot of mischief. But the AI is, for the most part, still being used as a tool by somebody with the mischief in mind, who then wants to set something out there in the world. And then it's spread by more traditional means, whether it's a social media channel, whether it's the traditional media pick up on it and amplify it. So I actually, don't blame social media as much as traditional media, because it should be their job to be the quality control. It should be their job to do the fact checking. And if they don't do that, it's a dereliction of duty.
Yeah. And I think that, and I've mentioned this in a couple of conversations, which is that AI has the potential, and in my daily practice, I use it a lot to check the facts. I'm getting a story, I just put it on an AI tool and say, can you just double check this? Tell me the sources. Is it correct or not? And you can do a deep research if the basic research doesn't give you something satisfactory. And I find it incredibly useful. The stuff that I would take much longer to spend online. And I don't see any reason not to have very powerful, let's say, AI wrappers, so software that allows you to have a specific goal, saying, use this as my fact checker. I want you to screen these things. It doesn't mean that, there are universal facts that are true, but at least give me the backstory. Where does it come from? What's the origin? Has it been verified? So that's my optimistic side, which I keep getting pushback when I say, people say, oh no, it's not going to happen. It's like, I really think in practice today, it's got more of an upside than a downside.
I agree with that completely. I do worry about the political reaction, because there are many people in power who do not want the facts. They want their narrative to prevail. And if the facts, start to bubble up, then they're unhappy because it undermines, what they've been saying. I mean, we saw this in the U.S. where, one political party at least had the view that all of the social media were working against them by filtering out conservative sources and saying that was what was presenting a biased source of information to people who weren't really in a position to know the difference. Now, if this happens with AI, for example, if AI says, okay, we're going to filter out bad sources of information, well, is it a value question or is it somehow objective? Which one is a bad source of information?
Yeah, there's a big debate, and this is what is a fact and what is the truth, which I get very irritated because I feel it's thrown around. People saying, "Oh, we live in the post-truth age, and we don't have facts anymore," and stuff like that. Now, as somebody who studied philosophy, I think that's a really deep misunderstanding of how you can come to terms with what is the truth that is about. It's you have to have a long discussion, and then you can say, okay, I have subcategories of facts within that realm. And in the realm of politics, it's a lot of the time it's an opinion and an interpretation of an event, not there's no objective fact in what you say. There's the fantastic book by Yuval Noah Harari, Nexus. He spends a lot of time saying, how are we going to cope in a world where we can't agree on the basic facts. And my kind of immediate answer is, well, we never lived in a world where the facts were that obvious. Whether you go all the way back to Plato, you still have to dispute whether this is an objective truth or it's an interpretation that we have. So I think for me, the question is not, will the truth prevail or not, but it's, will we have a more open and nuanced conversation where multiple perspectives are tolerated by people, and you fight over them, but then you don't reject people out of hand because they disagree with you, and you try to bring people to be more open to all the perspectives that we have to live with. And I think that's where I worry about the kind of conversation about the truth and the facts, because it simplifies things. What we need to, I think, admit is that things are just complicated, and that every time there's a new question, you unfortunately have to spend time trying to figure it out. And most people just don't want to do that. So I mean, as somebody who also works in the world of communication, I mean, how do you simplify complex topics, and how do you make it interesting for people who are kind of lazy by default, because we don't want to think about it, we don't want to analyze them in depth? So how do you kind of balance that?
Yeah, well, I'd say I would go back to the first principles of being a journalist, is that you're not writing for the people that you talk to. You're not writing for the sources of information. You're writing for the consumers of that information. And at the Wall Street Journal, for example, we had readers who were farmers in Iowa. It was the proverbial example, will a farmer in Iowa understand what we're writing? And I had some very tragically funny stories involving the European Union, where even an editor at the Wall Street Journal would write back to me in all capital letters, European Parliament, ? Explain what it is. Chancellor of the Exchequer, explain what he does. GNP, how would we define this? So I was taught over many, many years to take nothing for granted, so that even I think the editor actually knew the answers to these questions, but he wanted me to have to explain it in the story to the farmer in Iowa. So generally speaking, and the best way that I ever got this thrown back in my face was a BBC reporter in Brussels once, whom I called to pitch a story, and he said to me, and I quote, "Tell me why my editor's mother should care." And that's something that I've quoted many, many times. We need to make sure that the complicated stories that we're trying to work with are intelligible to the average EU citizen. That doesn't mean oversimplifying it into curvature of bananas directed and nonsense like this, but trying to make things accessible to the average citizen.
Yeah, and I think there's a Richard Feynman quote where he says that if you really understand something very complicated, you're able to explain it in very, very simple terms, and that's the sign that you've actually cracked that question.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting way of putting it. Now, you yourself have a number of projects, but one of them is a campaign that you're leading, which is a nonpartisan campaign aimed at the U.S. Administration. So tell us a bit about what is that campaign, and how do you manage to be nonpartisan in 2025? Is that even possible?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. So the campaign is called Tax Fairness for Americans Abroad. And this affects any American citizen who's living outside of the United States. So that is people like me who are born in the United States, but also a lot of so-called accidental Americans who might have been born in the States or been born to one U.S. parent in the U.S. or out of the U.S. And really have no connection to the U.S., but according to the U.S. government, they're U.S. citizens. And the United States, unlike every other civilized country in the world, taxes its citizens based on their worldwide income, regardless where they live. And that's the crux of the problem. It is based in Belgium. I haven't lived in the U.S. in 35 years, but I have to file an American tax declaration every year, despite having no U.S. income. And this is, something that's annoying for me. For some people, it's virtually impossible because they may not even speak English, and they're supposed to navigate a complicated internal revenue service tax declaration, and then file that. So it causes a lot of pain and misery. And then there's related issues having to do with financial account reporting. Just like anybody living in Belgium listening to this, you probably have to make a declaration to the Belgian National Bank every year saying if you got any foreign accounts in, let's say, offshore or wherever. I have to do the same thing for the American government about my quote unquote foreign account, which is my local Belgian bank account, and if you got multiple accounts, you have to declare each of them on a complicated form that doesn't store your information from year to year. So you need to literally type it in from year to year. It's just really annoying. The problem is you should really play this game, because if you don't, then the US government can come after you and the penalties are draconian. So we're fighting to change all this, and we've got a good possibility of changing the law. And to your point about, how do we do this on a nonpartisan basis? Well, surprisingly, President Trump has been one of our best advocates. So, when we started the campaign last July, we didn't know that he was going to be elected president. But during the campaign, he pledged to end the double taxation of Americans abroad. And that's what this is all about. So now we've actually got, the first presidential candidate, whoever paid attention to the issue, is actually in the White House, has kept it as a list of one of the priorities for his administration. And as a result of that, we were able to parlay this into a bill which was already introduced into the House of Representatives last December. It should be reintroduced into the new Congress very, very soon. And we've got real hope that it'll get done.
Now, this is probably I don't know how to describe it, the noisiest political agenda and news cycle that we've ever been into. I think I really don't think there's been such an intense, news coming out of the White House, but also internationally. So, there's just a lot of things that, absorb political attention. How do you cut through that noise? Have you been able to get people's attention, just because it cannot be the top priority? I mean, I don't even know where it fits, but there's just so much noise and so much going on. How do you get people to think about that particular quite niche topic?
Yeah, well, I would say one of the things I tell people in my day job as a communication strategist is there's a market for every story. You just need to find the market. And when it comes to tax law, there's some very specialized tax publications. Bloomberg Tax is one. There's another one, Tax Facts. So we've been talking mostly to this expert audience of people who actually do understand the issue, get the issue, and can ask the smart questions. And then we try to leverage every milestone that comes up that's out of our hands. A great example recently was the election of an American Pope. As an American Pope, he should be subject to these same rules that I am and that any other American overseas is. So we jumped on that. Literally, I think he was named Pope on a Wednesday or Thursday. On Friday, we had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, "Is the IRS going to go after the new Pope?" And that really went far and wide. Has been picked up all over the French media, for example, Canadian media, other American media picked up on it. So we basically leveraged something else that was happened to use that to our advantage and get some attention for the issue.
Yeah, I can see that being memified, like the Pope's coat and his tax returns. No, I think what you're saying is really spot on, which is, find the niche and the market for the story. Because especially in the EU and in Brussels, we all live in a niche space. I mean, basically, everybody tends to have a topic that's very, very, very important for a very, very small group of people. And for them, they live and breathe that topic, and they can make a difference to it. But for most people, it's like, what the hell are you talking about? It's so obscure and so specific. So I think finding that is indeed very important. And that brings me to the kind of the conversations and the channels. So, you followed the EU influencer discussions. We have our next EU influencer coming up in September. And we're going to ask the question again, where is the conversation taking place? There's been some new data shared recently by Burson on, LinkedIn being now the dominant platform in Brussels. That was already there at the last EU influencer. We saw that trend. Followed by X, which has not disappeared despite, I think what a lot of people were thinking or hoping, and then Instagram. And then lower down the road, we have Mastodon. That's in that survey, which I have some questions about. So what are you personally spending your time on? And how do you think the channel mix is moving? I know you mentioned Blue Sky earlier.
Yeah, well, so I completely agree with you on LinkedIn. I think that is by far the most influential place for people to have thoughtful conversations about all kinds of topics. The beauty of LinkedIn as well is that it's micro-targeting, people who already are connected to one another on a given issue, and then the algorithm can help other people discover that issue. So I think LinkedIn will stay that way. The other great thing about LinkedIn is just you know who the people are. I don't think there are a lot of fake profiles on LinkedIn the way that there are on X or other platforms. For my clients in the communication space, we're still focused on LinkedIn and X. We still use X because we know that it's influential among journalists and policymakers, which is our, two of our core audiences. I've started experimenting with Blue Sky because I saw that some people were saying they were leaving X for Blue Sky. So I've got an account and I just started following other people and sharing the occasional thing to see how people feel about that. But I think in terms of reaching, let's say, real people, not just sort of policy experts and professional people, Facebook and Instagram are still very important for tax fairness for Americans abroad, for example. We've got all of those accounts, LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and Instagram. Not yet Blue Sky. One of the reasons I'm checking out Blue Sky is to see whether it's worth our while to be there.
Yeah, I think that LinkedIn is definitely the kind of professional networking place in Brussels now. I think X is there, but it's really the engagement I'm seeing at least is really much lower and much less qualitative. So I think people are just there to just check it out, but the engagement there is much lower. I think people feel much more comfortable engaging on LinkedIn, and then on Instagram, I think there is a younger demographic which also likes a different kind of language, which is really growing, and I'm seeing that. We will have a session on that, and I think it's becoming more important, and it's the language and the kind of environment that's changing. What I see with the clones, the Mastodon, the Threads, the Blue Sky, is that they're kind of there, but they're even smaller niches. So for some specific subtopics, you get people, but it's really hard to do because I think if you're more of a generalist, it gets really difficult to get get traction if you don't invest in a kind of more systemic way. I mean, in terms of and of course there's the other bit, which is Substack and podcasts and things like that. I feel personally I've got into the habit of listening to more and more podcasts. So it's actually to some degree replacing my news diet, but it's podcasts that sometimes have news focus. The rest is politics UK, politics US, and then other things. So it gives me a little angle on certain things. Are you kind of more of a podcast and Substack consumer than before, or do you see that as kind of niche tools?
I'm not into Substack at all. I mentioned the word bandwidth earlier. I've got bandwidth limitations as well. So I read every day with this U.S. bias because of this campaign that I'm running. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Reuters, Google News, Le Soir, La Libre Belgique, EU Observer, Euractiv, Politico. So I'm consuming a lot of news already. I literally don't have any time left for Substack. But I do spend time, on LinkedIn and other social media channels every day. Mostly, most of it is, I'd say, work related. If we put this campaign in the work category, just for pleasure, my guilty pleasure is Instagram. So I spend more time on Instagram than is probably healthy, but I learn enough stuff there that makes it worthwhile.
Interesting. I'm finding that Substack and it's journalists like Dave Keating who are writing pieces, which are kind of like nice little opinion editorial pieces, or even doing some streams. And I think there's a new category of journalists who are emerging there, and it's a nice addition to the mix as the paywalls are all going up. So unless you're already subscribed, I have a couple of that I'm subscribed to. But I don't know if you've seen the CNN is really adding up the paywalls now. So it'll start getting more expensive to get through that. Maybe just to finish off on the question of social media, do you think, and this was a big debate before, and I feel it's kind of less so now, has social media created some of the polarization and the negativity that we've seen in the political discussion? I think some people are saying the world's going to a terrible place with massive polarization, and it's all because of Facebook, X, Instagram, etc., or TikTok. What are your views on that? Are these just channels, or are these the devil's tools? I mean, a little biased way of putting it, but what do you think?
I think they're both, honestly. I also think that people, if they spend too much time on Facebook, it can be unhealthy because you tend to self-select a bubble of people who agree with you. On purpose, I stay connected to some people on Facebook that I consider lunatics and political, fringe, but I want to know what they're saying. I want to be able to monitor that every once in a while, engage with them. It's sometimes amusing to some of my friends when they start to engage with some of my content with very different political views, that they get in fights. But I keep them for that reason. I feel it is important to know what the other half of the country, let's say, is thinking about, and not close yourself off in a bubble. I think social media makes it, unfortunately, super easy to share misinformation, whether that's Facebook, X, WhatsApp, whatever. I think they're all very far too easy to share misinformation. I liked it better when the platforms had some, at least a minimal content moderation. They might pop up something, say, "You sure you don't want to read this before you share it?" Or you sure that this one's been flagged for misinformation? You sure you want to share it? I kind of like that stuff, but that's, I think, all history now.
Yeah, I think that we have gotten used to the fact that we kind of know that a lot of this is. I mean, I would say there's a kind of more widespread knowledge that these things are not to be taken at face value, although there's still some people, especially people who are less comfortable with the technology, who tend to believe far too much what they read. One thing that I find is still profoundly ironic is on X, that you have a button on Grok, which you can kind of click on a tweet or a post, whatever they call it, and it analyzes it, and it kind of always gives you a bit of a perspective. And if you just do it on Elon Musk's post, it's always saying, this is probably factually incorrect, et cetera, et cetera. And I just find that really interesting. I'm just not sure what it's supposed to do, but I do like this idea of at least challenging things that's built into the system. So I think that's quite an interesting thing. Now, this is a conversation we're going to have with the EU influencers coming up. So what are the kind of burning questions you would like us to put to them? What do you think are the things that we need to know for going into 2026?
Well, I think my main question is a rather philosophical question. Do you feel that you're making a difference? So in communications, you know as well as I do, I think that you can measure reach. That's how much noise are you making, how many eyeballs, how many listeners, how many viewers. But to go from there to, is it actually making a difference, I think is a much more challenging thing to measure. So I would like to know from people, do you have any evidence that you're making a difference? If so, how, and how can other people learn from that?
Very, very good point. For me, it's like, if you read a post or watch a small video, it can sometimes really shape your perspective on something. And you hear a lot of the time, and I think with young people, they kind of say like, "Oh, this is like that. Too much sugar is bad for you." It's like, is that TikTok or Instagram? It's like, I want to know where you got that from. And a lot of the time, the answer will be, well, I kind of got it from a trusted TikTok or whatever it is. So not any garbage. And I do believe that these things do get into your brain, and you get hit by it. But it's a very interesting question. It's like, why are you doing this, and do you think you're making a difference?
Yeah.
Now coming back to one of my favorite questions, which is, when you meet young people who are about to enter, let's say, Brussels, in this age of AI, where we don't really know what technical skills will matter. And I think now my question is actually at the beginning of your studies and at the end. And I'm saying at the beginning because perhaps you would say there's certain things you shouldn't study anymore because of AI. So do you have any advice for, young friends who are coming up to you saying, what should I study or what should I do to get started in life? And there's the whole recent story about how AI is already starting to kill certain entry-level jobs. So,
yeah, well, that's a whole podcast in itself, probably.
Yes.
But I would say all studies are good. Look, you studied philosophy. I studied German literature. Look where we are today. So you can go anywhere with a liberal arts degree. One of my sons actually studied AI, so he's working in that space now. My advice to people, especially in this super technology charged world in which we live, is to not become overly dependent on technology. Get out of the office more often, talk to real people. When I say real people, I don't mean the EU policy bubble. Talk to real people. Try to talk to people outside of Brussels, because that helps give you a perspective on what you're doing and what your clients or contacts are doing, what the EU is doing. And I think it's just an invaluable perspective to talk to real people. Anecdotally, when I was a journalist, it was sometimes the most difficult task that I was given by an editor. So could you do what's called a vox pop, the voice of the people? Go out and find some real people to talk to. I would literally just take my notebook and a recorder, and I would go out on the public squares and just ask people passing by, because I think I didn't know many real people. Almost everybody that I knew was a lobbyist, worked for one of the EU institutions, a journalist, or somehow a professional, let's say a white collar worker. And aside from interviewing, your cleaning lady and a taxi driver, I mean, your non-EU bubble was pretty limited. So I think literally going out and asking people on the street, or in your hometowns, questions, I think is the best way.
But not on Squad Muse, so you have like the whole intern and MEP crowd that will give you something
Exactly.
very, very aligned. Very, very interesting. I think that it's the more flexible your studies are, the better. And there's a shift from the very hardcore like computer engineering and things like that, which I think there's a real question mark about which part of those skills are going to be useful, and the more meta skills about learning to read, to reflect, philosophy, literature, or whatever, which then allows you to approach these tools in a different way. So I think it's something very, very interesting. Okay, so now it's time for our recommendations.
Okay.
Recommendations of the week.
We just had to roll that jingle. So Brandon, what are your recommendations?
Well, this is probably not rocket science to anybody, but in terms of AI tools, I'm a big fan of Perplexity, and it's for many of the reasons that we've been discussing here today. It lists its sources, so it's easier to fact check things that you get from Perplexity. I am using the paid version right now, Perplexity Pro, so there's a little call out to them. EU Scream, I am a fan of James Cantor and what he's trying to do with EU Scream, putting a diversity of voices to challenge some of the misinformation which is out there in the world. And we didn't talk about wine in the end, but I have a small wine business, and I thought it might be interesting for people to check out something if they're interested in learning about wine and rare grape varieties and obscure wines and things like this. There's a site called winefolly.com, which I turn to every time I have to prepare a wine tasting.
So what is your wine recommendation of the month? So let's stay. What do you have a specific wine that we need to taste? Let's go for a summer wine and something that you would recommend outdoors on a, let's say, nice summer's day, which is not always the case here.
Okay, well, since this month my wine tasting is Sardinian wines, because I've just been in Sardinia and visited 6 or 7 wineries, I would go for one called Touriga, which is from, it's a red blend with Cannonau and other local Sardinian red grapes. Super wonderfully complex wine. It goes with any sort of grilled things, pecorino cheese, and fried things as well. So it's a kind of a good all-round red wine for the summer.
Fantastic. So we will list it in the article so people can check it out. Thank you very much for that. My recommendation, actually, staying on AI tools, is I'm a fan, as I've said many times, of deep research. So I use it on ChatGPT, on Gemini, and on Perplexity, where I'm not. I feel that it doesn't always hit the mark, but I think it's interesting. Copilot from Microsoft and Claude have literally just added a research button on their own tools, and Copilot actually is doing a pretty good job at it. So I've been testing it just a couple of times. The advantage, obviously, is that you are within your data system, so you're not potentially sharing data with other tools. Well, if you put it on OpenAI and you don't know where the data is going to go, this is closed. So that's quite interesting. And Claude, I think, has a kind of a different way of thinking about things. I like it for long form text and for analyzing bigger blocks of text. So on the research, it seems to have that intelligence, which is kind of a different one. So what I find so fascinating with these tools is that you get every single deep research will give you a completely different output. And it's literally like you had a different person doing a little piece of research and thinking, and it kind of matches the personality of the different tools. So quite interesting. So that's my recommendation. That's all we have time for. Brandon, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your experience, and some of your thoughts with us. Looking forward to it, and we continue this conversation online and in person. Bye for now.
Thank you, Phil. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the ZNL podcast. Did you like it? If so, please share it on your social media, subscribe, and give us a comment. We will see you again on the next episode. Until then, remember, stay always one step ahead.